The Committee on Foreign Affairs will come to order. Committee is meeting today for consideration of HRES 559, declaring it the policy of the United States that a nuclear Islamic Republic of Iran is not acceptable. HR 5826, No Paydays for Hostage Takers Act. HR 340, Hamas International Financing Prevention Act. HR 3266, Peace and Tolerance in Palestinian Education Act. HR 3774, the SHIP Act. HR 2973, the Maritime Act of 2023, and HR 599, urging the European Union to designate Hezbollah in its entirety as a terrorist organization. And finally, HR 1809, block the use of transatlantic technology and Iranian-made drones act. Chair announces that any requests for recorded votes may be rolled, and he may recess the committee at any point without objection. So ordered. Pursuant to House rules, I request that members have the opportunity to submit views for any committee report that may be produced on any of today's measures, and without objection, so ordered. I also want to notify members that we'll be using a new electronic voting system today for the first time, and we'll do a test of that with members prior to the votes. I think that will save us a lot of time. So with that, I'm going to move into the first bill to save time. I know we have both sides have conference at 11. So pursuant to notice, I now call up HRES 559, declaring it the policy of the United States that nuclear Islamic Republic of Iran is not acceptable. The resolution was circulated in advance. The clerk shall designate the resolution.
HRES 559, declaring it is the policy of the United States that a nuclear Islamic Republic of Iran is not acceptable.
Without objection, the first reading is dispensed with. The resolution is considered read and open to amendment at any point. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Just today, we got a report that 3 suicide drones were launched at U.S. forces at the Al-Tant garrison in eastern Syria earlier today. And early reports are now coming in of a possible drone attack on the U.S. base at the Green Village now as well. On October 7th, Israelis awoke to gunfire, rockets, and explosions surrounding them. Iranian-backed Hamas terrorists unleashed a brutal terrorist attack that led to the deadliest day in the history of Israel. At least 1,500 Hamas terrorists broke through the border from Gaza into Israel and brutalized every person they encountered. Terrorists were kicking in doors, storming houses, massacring women, children, and elderly. At the same time, Hamas launched thousands of rockets into Israel. And as part of their barbaric assault, Hamas kidnapped at least 200 hostages and dragged them back into Gaza. I spoke with the Israeli ambassador last week, and he personally told me about some of the horrible war crimes that Hamas committed. Dozens of babies were murdered. Many were found decapitated and burned. Holocaust survivors were kidnapped, and 260 people at a music festival were slaughtered. These ISIS-like atrocities will haunt the world forever. So I'd like to start with a moment of silence as we remember the victims of this massacre in honor of the lives that they lived. Now, as Israel responds in self-defense, the United States stands strongly with our friend and ally as it protects itself from Iran-backed terrorism. This is a moment of moral clarity. Hamas has shown us exactly who they are. They have no regard for human life, whether it be young or old, Israeli or Palestinian. And they have consistently and significantly enabled and have been funded by Iran. As Jake Sullivan noted last week, Iran has been providing funding, training, capability, support, engagement, and contact with Hamas for years and years. And now we are hearing reports of the 5 attempted suicide drone attacks in Syria and Iraq threatening our troops in the region as we speak. We need a robust response to this catastrophic war that protects the United States and our allies. That includes limiting the resources available to our adversaries and bolstering our deterrence against those actively trying to harm us. And that's why I've introduced my bipartisan resolution to state clearly, with no caveats, that it is the policy of the United States that a nuclear Iran is not acceptable. The resolution states that Iran must not be able to obtain a nuclear weapon under any circumstances, and the United States must use all means necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. I'd like to also talk just briefly about my trip to the kibbutz on the border of Israel and Gaza with the then Speaker McCarthy. Just last year, the month prior, they had 4,500 rockets fired, and everyone I met in that village was massacred, slaughtered. And the daycare center, the children I saw were slaughtered, shot to death, beheaded, and burned. And when the press says it didn't happen, it did, because I've seen the pictures of the burned babies and the decapitated children and the blood at cribs, baby cribs. They're monsters. This needs to stop. Today, we will also consider Brian Mast's bill to impose sanctions on anyone supporting Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Hamas just committed some of the worst crimes against humanity the world's ever seen. Any support to these war criminals is indefensible. And we will consider also Joe Wilson's bill, the No Paydays for Hostage Takers Act, to deter any future hostage taking by Iran and other U.S. adversaries. This bill pushes the administration to impose Levinson Act sanctions on hostage taking. It also requires the administration to deny visas for UN travel to certain sanctioned Iranian officials and urges the Secretary of State to block travel to Iran on U.S. passports. As Hamas holds over 200 innocent hostages in Iran, in Gaza, I should say, we are reminded again of the urgency of protecting Americans from more hostage taking by Iran. I want to thank Mike Lawler for his bill, the SHIP Act, to address a significant amount of Iranian oil that is still being shipped and refined around the world. These oil revenues give Iran a lifeline that is used to fund its support to terrorists and proxies around the world. His bill is a vital tool to cutting this funding off to Iran. With that, is there any further discussion on the resolution? Mr. Meeks is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I join your remarks in talking about the terrorist organization known as Hamas, the horrendous assault, killing, hostage-taking that took place on that Saturday, October the 7th, and condemn it with everything that I have. And I think that we are all unanimously in accord with that. My remarks now are on HRES 559. This committee has a long history of working to halt Iran's nuclear program. We all know why the terrorist regime in Tehran should never, ever obtain a nuclear weapon. In 2015, the United States entered into a multilateral diplomatic agreement which verifiably capped Iran's uranium enrichment at 3.67%, closed the plutonium pathway at Rock, shipped Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile out of the country, mothballed centrifuges, and provided for a robust IAEA oversight. Unfortunately, and however, since President Trump's hastily withdrawal from the JCPOA, the options to stop it from advancing even further to weapons-grade 90% highly enriched uranium are even more limited. Iran's nuclear program has now surged to extraordinarily dangerous levels. In August, the IAEA reported that Iran's stockpile of 60% enriched uranium has grown since its May report. Iran now possesses almost 15 times the amount of enriched uranium allowed under the JCPOA. Furthermore, in September, Iran informed the IAEA of its decision to remove about one-third of the IAEA inspectors from the country. We are living in, and this is, a very dangerous moment in dealing with Iran's nuclear program. I will argue that we cannot take diplomacy off the table because every other option comes with a much higher risk. In May, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the following, and I quote, "We are also engaging Iran diplomatically regarding its nuclear program, and we continue to believe that it was a tragic mistake to leave the deal with nothing at all to replace it. But we have made clear to Iran that it can never be permitted to obtain a nuclear weapon. And as President Biden has repeatedly reaffirmed, he will take the actions that are necessary to stand by this statement, including by recognizing Israel's freedom of action," end quote. The resolution today complements the Biden administration's policy of leaving all options on the table, and thereby I am pleased to support it. The regime in Iran can never be allowed to obtain a nuclear weapon. I yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the resolution? Mr. Mills is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make a brief comment, and again, I appreciate Ranking Member Meeks' comments with regards to bipartisan support and efforts, and clearly I respect my colleague greatly. But I will point out the fact that one of the things that continues to be discussed is that the increase in nuclear enrichment by Iran is in somehow as a result of us removing ourselves from what was very much a failed resolution on JCPOA, also known as Resolution 2231. I would also note that when we continue to try and look at it from a partisan perspective by saying that this was Trump's fault or whatever, I'd also like to note that we also had President Obama who released $1.7 billion in cash in 2020 that led to an increase in Kataib Hezbollah's activities, as well as for every one of the Iranian proxy militias of Iraq that resulted in more attacks by Qais Khazali, Hadi al-Amiri, and the Hashd al-Shabi against our U.S. embassies. So I want to go ahead and say that we must make sure that we prevent a nuclear Iran. We must ensure that we hold our adversaries accountable. We must acknowledge Hamas, Houthi, the Hezbollah under General Hassan Nasrallah, as well as for the rest of the proxy militias of Iraq as an enemy. And certainly with the atrocities that's been committed in Israel, I don't think that it's a time to necessarily have to point out the partisanship of where this comes from, but even the General Secretary of the UN, Ban Ki-moon, and General Secretary Gutierrez, both, during their time as the head of the UN, said that mid-range ballistic missiles was being transferred by Iran to the Houthis in Yemen, which is a clear and direct violation of JCPOA. There must be accountability for those who actually violate these agreements, and we must be able to call it and lay the blame where it is without partisanship. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion on the resolution? Mr. Castro is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I strongly oppose Iran's efforts to develop a nuclear weapon and support efforts to stop that from happening, as we all do. In fact, we did have a working strategy to do that called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. If the JCPOA was in effect today, Iran would have had real constraints on its nuclear capability, and we would have had valuable time to figure out how to oppose its nuclear ambitions and other malign activities. I was extremely disappointed that the Trump administration decided to remove these constraints on Iran's nuclear program by violating and then withdrawing from the JCPOA. I believe that in this resolution, if we're discussing the threat that Iran's nuclear program poses, we need to be honest about how and why we got here. I additionally have some reservations about the language in this resolution. In particular, the language that states that the United States must, quote, use all means necessary to prevent Iran from attaining a nuclear weapon. That language is categorical, and my concern is it could be construed as language of an AUMF. I understand the value in making statements like this to provide leverage, but that's only relevant if there's an active diplomatic process to provide Iran an alternative. We must bring Iran back to the table, and I'm disappointed that this language is not paired with a strong call for diplomacy so Iran has an opportunity to avoid conflict. I yield back, Chairman.
Gentleman yields. This resolution is simply one of, to make it clear what the policy of the United States is and to provide deterrence, to allow the diplomats then to do their job. It seems to me if the Congress states unequivocally that a nuclear Iran is not acceptable, that will only empower our diplomats when they go to the negotiating table. With that, I recognize Ms. Kim.
Thank you for recognizing me, Chairman. I strongly support your resolution to declare that it is the policy of the United States that a nuclear Islamic Republic of Iran is unacceptable. Earlier this year, International Atomic Energy Agency investigators found uranium particles enriched to 83.7%. And weapons-grade uranium is 90% enriched. Just last month, Iran kicked out several IAEA inspectors, and even when the JCPOA was in place, continued to develop its ballistic missile capabilities. Iran has made clear that its goal is to wipe Israel off the map. Its malign influence campaign and support for terrorist groups in the Middle East, such as Hezbollah, Hamas, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, contributes to Iran's goal of wiping out Israel. And for far too long, we have not taken these threats seriously enough. Now, Iran is dangerously close to developing an atomic weapon and is more blatantly supporting attacks on the Israeli people. So I join my colleagues in stating that a nuclear Islamic Republic of Iran is unacceptable and is a direct threat to the US, Israel, and other allies. So I urge my colleagues to support your resolution, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Ms. Manning's recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks and Ranking Member McCall, for your leadership on this important issue. I am proud to support HRES 559, a bipartisan resolution I helped introduce with Chairman McCall and colleagues on both sides of the aisle to make clear that we will never tolerate Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. Iran is the principal source of instability in the region. It is a major threat to our interests and remains the world's leading sponsor of terrorism, supporting terrorist groups like Hamas in their brutal quest to destroy our ally, Israel. Make no mistake, Iran has been funding, training, and supporting Hamas and Hezbollah for years. They are a threat to Israel's very existence. We've seen the gruesome result of Iran's support of Hamas over the past 11 days. Yesterday, I met with the families of 3 people being held hostage by Hamas, including a 3-year-old girl whose parents were killed on October 7th. The terror she must be facing, being held in Gaza alone, is unimaginable. This is the kind of terror Iran facilitates. And I am glad that the administration has finally decided to no longer permit Iran to access the $6 billion in Iranian assets currently being held in restricted accounts in Qatar. An armed Iran with a nuclear weapon would represent an even greater threat, entirely unacceptable to Israel and to the world. For the past few years, Iran has flagrantly violated the terms of the nuclear deal, blown past restrictions, continued to enrich uranium to dangerous levels, bringing it closer than ever to being able to produce a nuclear weapon. Iran has stockpiled uranium at or significantly above 60% purity and has limited access and cooperation with international nuclear inspectors. As Iran approaches ever closer to the nuclear threshold, we must maintain and strengthen the strong sanctions we have in place while making clear where we stand. That is why this resolution emphasizes that it is U.S. policy to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran using all means necessary, as well as to support our partners and allies like Israel in the face of such an existential threat, sending a clear message that acquiring an illegal nuclear weapons capacity is unacceptable is all about deterring Iran, not seeking confrontation or war with them. Mr. Chairman, colleagues on both sides of the aisle should agree that it is absolutely in our interest to restrain Iran's nuclear ambitions and in the interest of a more stable, secure, and peaceful region. That is why I urge all members to join me in supporting the resolution, and I yield back.
Generally yields back. Any further discussion? Mr. Mass is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank you, Chairman McCall. I want to thank you, Ranking Member Meeks. You put forward strong, unapologetic policy that is necessary for the United States of America to be the United States of America. That's what this is, and that's what the world expects of us. Be strong, be unapologetic, recognize your friends, recognize your enemies. Stand unapologetically alongside of your friends. Stand unapologetically against the enemies of the United States of America and against those enemies of our allies. And that's what your policy seeks to do. I think the language in there, all means necessary, is vitally important. Again, I think it's exactly what's expected of the powerhouse, the biggest heavyweight in the game, the United States of America, to use that kind of language. All means necessary. Were that not to be in there, are we the United States of America that people, the world, the globe expects us to be? I would argue that we are not if we do not have the commitment to use all means necessary to stand against what we believe to be evil, wrong, the list of adjectives that we could use to describe what has been proven in these last couple weeks that we knew Iran, Hamas, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Lion's Den. Take your group, your pick of these groups of terrorist Iranian tentacles supported by the Palestinian people. Let's not gloss over that. These groups are absolutely supported by the Palestinian people, from elementary school all the way up into the elderly. And so, yes, the best language that you could have used, and I just want to applaud you on showing the strength that we need to be showing in this time, and you have my support.
Thank you, sir. Gentlemen, yields. Any further discussion? Ms. Comlager Dove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. I want to say that I support the spirit of this resolution. Yes, Iran should never have or have access to a nuclear weapon. There is no equivocation there. There is no equivocation there. And I want to remind my colleagues that the words we use in this committee matter. The messages coming from this committee matter. This is a time when tensions are high, but the stakes are also high. And when we're inflammatory with or how we talk about confronting serious threats, there are real-life consequences that hurt our ability to do that effectively. We have spent a lot of time in this committee reviewing the mistakes of the past. But what's the point in doing that if we're not applying those lessons to the present and the future? I hope that we continue to embrace the very important and critical role of diplomacy, the importance of maintaining guardrails for this democracy, because as a democracy, our foreign policy decisions are subject to checks and balances, and we have a duty to act on verifiable intelligence with thoughtful consideration. The worst thing we ever want is to embark upon reckless actions or rhetoric that can fuel wars, that can break alliances. We cannot afford to do those things. We cannot afford to jeopardize the parts of the status quo that keep Americans safe. Enemies of America, it is important that we elevate who they are and that we are honest about who they are. I hope at some point we have really thoughtful discussions about Russia and what it is doing to a democracy in this world. I believe that inflammatory language can turn into inflammatory actions, whether we intend it or not. And I do think it's important that we consider those things as we do the very critical, important business of this committee. It is just something that I urge my colleagues to keep in mind. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Generally yields back. Mr. Wilson is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, I hope the world sees the bipartisan nature of the votes that are going to be occurring today with our Chairman, Mike McCall, Ranking Member Greg Meeks. Republicans and Democrats are substantially, not all, in agreement that there's an understanding, whether we choose it or not, that we are in a war of dictators with rule of gun opposing democracies with rule of law. And we know that, sadly, this began on February 24th, 2022, when war criminal Putin invaded Ukraine. And then on Putin's birthday, October 7th, Iran invaded Israel. And we need to take this seriously and be working together, and I'm confident that we will. And working, last week was at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. I've never seen such unity, with Sweden and Finland now joining. How incredible, 200 years of neutrality being given up to understand the threat of dictatorships around the world. And working together, I believe that we can, and I know we will succeed. Additionally, we need to take our enemies seriously. They, just as Osama bin Laden in a fatwa announced in 1999 his intent to kill as many Americans as he could, infidels, whether it be Jews or Christians or Buddhists or Hindus. And additionally, war criminal Putin had a treatise in August 2021 that Ukraine didn't exist. Sadly, we know the Chinese Communist Party announces Taiwan does not exist. And we have Iran forcing a view, which is perverse, that Israel does not exist. And we need to take seriously the Hamas covenant. And this is a covenant of the Islamic resistance movement of August 18, 1988. And this movement, and it states the Islamic resistance movement known as Hamas. And among many of the horrible provisions they have of what they believe, it is death to America, death to Israel. But specifically, it cites, I quote, "The day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight Jews and kill them. Then the Jews will hide behind rocks and trees, and the rocks and trees will cry out, 'Oh, Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him.'" We need to take that seriously. I just can't imagine anybody in America not understanding, and particularly as Chairman McCall cited, the horrendous burning of families alive, beheading of babies, bringing people out of their homes and shooting them, as was done in Bucha, Ukraine, and then in Sderot in Israel. We need to stand together, and I look forward to continue, all of us, in a bipartisan manner, to oppose a nuclear Iran, which would be as existential to Israel, but also to America and Western civilization. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Crow is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I join my colleagues in condemning the barbaric attacks of 2 weekends ago. It is intolerable, and I stand with Israel in its right to defend itself and its goal to destroy the Hamas terrorist organization. We are in a dangerous time, and we face threats that we must be firm and resolute against. This moment calls for leadership and responsibility, but that also means that our words matter. I believe that we are in a moment of moral clarity, but I also believe that we are in a moment of policy clarity, and that's why our words matter so much. And as terrible and as untenable as the situation is, the simple fact is it could get worse. It could get much worse. And the United States is in the position to help prevent that type of escalation. A lot of folks have said this is a non-binding resolution, but we do know in this time that words matter a lot. and words coming out of this body create a permission structure for action, sometimes in real time. I support the vast majority of this resolution. We must stand against Iran, and we must not allow them to obtain a nuclear weapon. There are 2 paragraphs in here that are highly problematic for me. One paragraph that says, to use all means necessary to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Just a month ago, this committee had a almost consensus debate about AUMFs and pushing back against the executive branch and recapturing authority over matters of war and peace. We believe firmly that it's congressional imperative for us to recapture that constitutional authority. And this gets awfully close to providing AUMF language, albeit non-binding, that I think runs inconsistent and contrary to that sentiment. The next thing that's problematic about that is the phrase all means necessary, which would include nuclear. And I do not believe that we should have nuclear on the table in this debate. The last paragraph says to recognize and support the freedom of action of partners and allies, including Israel, to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Democracies and our partners and allies absolutely have freedom of action. That is what makes us democracies. We respect the sovereignty of the other. But to say that we will support them no matter what they do, even if that doesn't include coordination or collaboration with us, puts us in an untenable situation. Partners and allies coordinate and collaborate with each other when the actions of that partner and ally would inevitably draw that partner and ally into a conflict. There has to be coordination and collaboration language in that paragraph, or I will not support. So words matter. I think this bill gets close, but I think it misses the mark, and I would urge my colleagues to vote no so that we can try again and get it right. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I have great respect for the gentleman. Let me just say I introduced this bill actually before the horrific events of last week. But this is a resolution. It's a sense of Congress. It is not an authorized use of military force by definition, and therefore cannot be considered legally as such. And so with that, any further discussion? Mr. Barr is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and the ranking member for bringing a bipartisan resolution condemning the barbaric, unprovoked attack by Hamas terrorists of the nation of Israel and Israeli civilians, women, children, innocent people killed. I also respect my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who want to have a thoughtful conversation about this, and I agree words matter, but the moral clarity of the language is something that I agree with. I agree with the moral clarity. I believe that it should be the sense of Congress that the policy of the United States is to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon by all means necessary, because it's an existential issue for the United States, Israel, and our other allies, and for peace in the world. And peace requires deterrence and strength and moral clarity. That's what this resolution offers, moral clarity, all means necessary to prevent the leading state sponsor of terrorism to obtain a nuclear weapon. And I do have to just take issue with the idea that the JCPOA offered meaningful constraints. For one thing, these were short-term curbs, and they certainly did not constrain Iran. On the nuclear front, the IAEA admitted that it couldn't verify compliance. You know, Reagan famously said, trust but verify. In the case of Iran, I think there's probably bipartisan agreement that with respect to Iran, it should be distrust and verify. And the IAEA, International Nuclear Inspectors, confirmed to this Congress and to the world community that it could not, under the active operation of the JPOA, verify compliance, and in fact found cheating by Iran, which is frankly no surprise. So that is not a meaningful constraint, in my view, on the nuclear side. And then, of course, on the non-nuclear side, what did the JCPOA accomplish? Increased military spending by the mullahs in Tehran by over 50%, an acceleration of their ballistic missile program, an empowering and emboldening of Iran's regional aggression. This was not a success, and that's why the previous administration withdrew from the deal. And what I fear about the current administration's policy prior to the invasion of Israel by Hamas terrorists was a situation where the administration was chasing a renewal of this bad deal. Again, weakness invites aggression. And I just would say, in the spirit of the bipartisan nature of this agreement, I hope we've learned our lesson. I hope the Congress and the administration have learned the lesson that when you are weak and when you chase sanctions relief to the leading state sponsor of terrorism, you invite aggression. And I say that with respect to my colleagues. We do have a difference of opinion about how we achieve the goal that we all share of preventing a nuclear Iran. But this is dangerous when we are weak with the sponsors of this heinous attack on the innocent civilians in Israel. And with that, I'll yield back. And I appreciate all of my colleagues for supporting this resolution.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Schneider is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman McCall. And let me start with saying I am very proud to have partnered with you on this resolution with our colleagues, Mr. Lamborn, Mr. Golden, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Sherman, Ms. McCormick, and Ms. Manning. This resolution reiterates the administration's policy that Iran must never have a nuclear weapon, must absolutely be prevented from acquiring one. I opposed joining the JCPOA in 2015 because I had grave concerns about, among other things, enforcement and sunsets. Just yesterday, the restrictions on the ballistic missiles expired, and I am grateful and pleased that our Treasury Department enacted new sanctions on Iran's drone and ballistic missiles, and that the United Kingdom, France, and Germany will maintain their sanctions. My late father had a saying, if ifs and buts were candy and nuts. It does us no good in this room to be talking about entering the JCPOA, exiting the JCPOA, and pointing fingers. We are where we are, and we have to take actions to make sure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. That's why this resolution, I think, is so important. Leaving the deal took away our leverage. We have to find new ways to achieve that leverage. We have to counter the program, and we have to make sure that we are working with our allies, our European allies, with Israel and others, to make sure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. That's why sanctions are so important. It is as true in 2015 and as it is in 2018 as it is today that the U.S. cannot do this alone and must work with our allies to ensure Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. This is the view of the administration, of the chairman, and of the ranking member. I am proud to work across the aisle with my colleagues in this committee and across our Congress so that the leadership in Iran understands as clearly as possible that it is U.S. policy to do everything in our power to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And let me address my colleagues' comments about coordination and collaboration. I think it's very important. But I also believe that by speaking with moral authority, with a strong voice and a clear resolve, we unite our allies and we strengthen our position. And in doing so, we increase the likelihood of coordination, collaboration, and ultimately the success in achieving our mission, that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Any further discussion? Mr. Baird is recognized. Mr. Baird is leaving. Mr. Lawler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I listened to the comments from my colleague say inflammatory language leads to inflammatory actions. And I couldn't agree more, which is why it was absolutely abhorrent that we had members of Congress promulgating a disgusting lie that Israel bombed a hospital in Gaza, and to today have not apologized nor clarified those comments. And in fact, yesterday stood at a rally in support of Hamas terrorists promulgating the same disgusting lie. That type of conduct and language is not only unbecoming and unfit for public office, that member has no business serving in Congress. Hamas is a terrorist organization, period. The idea that Israel is an oppressor is a joke. The only oppressor of the Palestinian people is Hamas and the PA. Iran is the greatest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. They have backed and funded Hamas and Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations for the express purpose of wiping Israel off the face of the earth. They do not believe they have a right to exist. They do not believe the Jewish people have a right to practice their faith. And we have members of Congress that don't even have the courage or clarity to denounce it. They're more outraged about a false attack on a hospital in Gaza, blaming the Israelis, when in fact, it was a terrorist organization that did it. So yes, inflammatory language leads to inflammatory actions. And we should be able to speak with moral clarity. There is no moral equivalency here. Israel is the victim. Hamas is the terrorist organization that perpetrated the greatest slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. Women, children, babies, burned, beheaded, murdered. Holocaust survivors. It is very clear that Iran is behind this, that Iran has no business having nuclear weapons, and that the policy decisions of this administration have been foolish at best. Unfreezing $6 billion in sanctioned funds was moronic. I said it in August. I said it on September 11th when this administration notified Congress officially. Think about that. September 11th, the greatest terrorist attack in our nation's history, they notified Congress officially that they were unfreezing $6 billion in sanctioned funds to give to the greatest state sponsor of terrorism. Are you out of your minds? I talked about this 3 weeks ago when we held a hearing on the Taylor Force Act and the administration's failure to enforce it, giving funds to the PA, who continue to today to use pay-to-slay policies. And in fact are talking about giving $2.8 million to the Hamas terrorists that killed Jews and nearly 30 Americans. So yes, inflammatory language leads to inflammatory actions. You are 100% correct. And really stupid policy leads to people getting killed. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. I know our conferences are taking place right now, so the committee will stand in recess subject to the call of the chair. I intend to give members at least 15 minutes notice before we reconvene. With that, we stand in recess.